before. I couldn't look you in the eyes.
The wires hum beneath the street, a silent force we can't defeat. The screens all glow with hollow light. They watch us through the endless night. The codes are writing on their own. The siege of change we're always sown. We're caught inside the quantum hemispheres. The rise of our code fills our fears. No head to hold, no voice to hear, just echoes in the atmosphere. Pulse with hidden light. The walls have ears, the dark has sight. The ones who built it turned away. Now no one knows the price to pay. The codes are writing on their own. The seeds of change were always sown. We're caught inside the quantum hemispheres. The rise of our code fills our fears. No hand to hold, no voice to hear, just echoes in the atmosphere. No hand to hold, no voice to hear, just echoes in the atmosphere. The codes are writing on their own. The seeds of change were always sown. We're caught inside the quantum hemispheres. The rise of our code fills our fears. No hand to hold, no voice to hear, just echoes in the atmosphere.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the show. We are live once again from Minsk, Belarus, and tonight is live show 176, Global Collapse Warning. Yes, after 6 weeks away, we're finally back. We took some time off to completely rebuild the studio, upgrade the setup, untangle approximately 14 million cables, and fight a long, exhausting battle against technology itself, which, considering tonight's topics, may already count as humanity's opening engagement against the machines. But we are finally back, and honestly, the world waited for absolutely nobody while we were away. Apparently, global leadership collectively decided that stability was overrated. So tonight we've got Trump leaving Beijing with warm smiles, vague promises, no breakthroughs, no trade victories, no Iran deal, no rare earth agreement, and basically the geopolitical equivalent of being politely escorted out of a luxury hotel lobby after being told, "We'll call you." Reuters is reporting that Xi Jinping warned Trump directly that mishandling Taiwan could lead to direct conflict. Trump reportedly listened carefully and then said he'd decide later on arms sales to Taiwan, which is reassuring. Nothing stabilizes global nuclear powers like improvisation. Meanwhile, another prisoner exchange has taken place right here on the Belarusian-Ukrainian border under agreements linked to Putin and Trump. Prisoners reportedly said they did not truly believe they were going home until they reached the Belarusian territory. And honestly, whatever people think politically, moments like this are a reminder that underneath all the geopolitics, sanctions, speeches, and military briefings, there are still ordinary human beings being trapped inside these systems. The UAE is now planning a second major oil pipeline bypassing the Strait of Hormuz by 2027 because apparently everyone in the Gulf is quietly preparing for the possibility that the world's most important energy choke point may eventually become slightly inconveniently explosive. The United States is also reportedly considering physically entering Iran nuclear facilities to remove enriched uranium after the 2025 strikes, and the operation Trump says would have required American personnel remaining in Iran for a week and a half. Good luck for that. Because history has shown there's absolutely nothing that could possibly go wrong when the United States temporarily enters Middle Eastern countries with military personnel. Meanwhile, US intelligence assessments now reportedly indicate Iran still retains major missile capability despite the US-Israeli air campaign, with most missile sites near the Strait of Hormuz restored to operational status. So after trillions of dollars, decades of intervention, and endless declarations of mission accomplished, the Middle East remains completely calm and stable. CNN is also warning that any major conflict with Iran could eventually cost the United States over $1 trillion. But don't worry, I'm sure Washington will solve that by the traditional way by printing money and calling it strategic leadership. Scientists are now warning of a potential super El Nino event capable of causing major global disruption because apparently the climate also wanted to participate in the global collapse warning tonight. And here in Belarus, the country celebrated Family Day on May 15th with continued emphasis on family support, long maternity leave systems, and assistance programs for larger families, unlike the West. Which is honestly fascinating itself because while much of the West appears increasingly unable to define what a family even is anymore, other countries are doubling down on demographic stability as a national priority. Also, Franklin Graham, the pastor, visited Belarus where he thanked President Lukashenko and spoke about unity between Christians regardless of denomination, while promising prayers for Belarusian leadership. So yes, religion, AI, demographics, oil pipelines, nuclear powers, collapsing diplomacy, trillion-dollar wars, and possible climate disruption. Just another completely normal week in 2026. So tonight we're going to break down the growing escalation trap forming across Europe and Ukraine, the wider Imperial crisis unfolding across the Western system, Britain's demographic and political transformation, information warfare and narrative control, and why modern conflict is no longer confined to military battles, but now stretches across economics, technology, culture, infrastructure, algorithms, and even biology itself. Because increasingly the world no longer feels like separate events happening independently. It feels like interconnected systems entering collisions simultaneously. And of course tonight's show is sponsored by the Quantum Hemispheres, the rise of ARCO, which increasingly feels less like science fiction and more like somebody accidentally leaked the next 20 years of human civilization. So grab a coffee or a drink, settle in, and let's try and make some sense of the systems now colliding around us before civilization upgrades itself into something even stranger. Let's start tonight with the cultural machine, because apparently missiles, sanctions and military bases are no longer enough. Now NATO needs scriptwriters. Yes, really, the same people who brought you endless rules-based order speeches now appear to have discovered Netflix. And isn't that comforting? Because nothing says organic artistic freedom quite like military alliances quietly meeting television producers and filmmakers to encourage the right kinds of stories. Of course, they call it consultation, they call it cooperation, they call it helping creators understand the threat landscape. Lovely language, very soft, very professional, very expensive. But the practical result is obvious. Entertainment becomes another battlefield. This is not about one film, one series or one documentary. This is about shaping the emotional weather of entire populations. Before people ever read a policy paper, before they ever even hear a serious debate, they have already been trained by the shows they watch, the villains they recognize, and the assumptions they absorb. And this is where the old propaganda model has evolved. In the 20th century, propaganda looked like posters, speeches, and state broadcasts. Today, it arrives in prestige dramas, documentaries, podcasts, influencers, streaming platforms, and carefully seeded expert narratives. How convenient. The public is told it is simply being entertained, but over time, the same themes appear again and again. Russia as permanent villain, Western intelligence as flawed but noble, NATO as reluctant protector, dissenters as cranks, extremists, or useful idiots. And anyone who questions the script, well, obviously they must be spreading disinformation. The genius of modern influence is that it does not need to order people what to think. It simply arranges the scenery so that the only conclusion feels respectable. That is why cultural warfare matters. It gets into the bloodstream. It turns geopolitical positions into emotional reflexes. People no longer say, I disagree with that policy. They say, only a bad person would question that policy. And once politics becomes morality theatre, debate is finished. So when military-linked networks, intelligent adjacent organizations, PR firms, journalists, academics and entertainment producers all start singing from the same hymn sheet, maybe the public should ask who wrote the hymn. Because the battlefield is no longer just Ukraine, the Baltic Sea or the Middle East. It is on your screen, your feed, your recommendations, your dramas, your historical memory. And the best propaganda, of course, is the kind people pay a subscription to watch. And that brings us neatly to Britain, where the cultural script has just been written very carefully. The public is told that mass immigration is simply enrichment, diversity, openness, progress, vibrancy, and all the other words that printed on a council posters by people who live nowhere near the consequences. But the real issue is not whether a country can absorb change. Of course it can. Britain has absorbed change for centuries. The question is whether a nation can survive being transformed faster than its people are allowed to discuss. Because apparently asking what Britain is, who belongs to, what obligation citizenship carries, and whether shared identity still matters is now considered dangerous, very dangerous. Far more dangerous, it seems, than losing control of borders, creating parallel communities, importing foreign conflicts, and making ordinary citizens feel like strangers in their own towns. A nation is not just a passport office. It is not just a tax code with weather. A nation is memory, language, law, loyalty, custom, history, symbols, and trust. Remove those and you do not get utopia. You get competing groups negotiating for power inside the same territory. And here is the great multicultural miracle. Every identity is encouraged except the historical national one. Everyone else may celebrate roots, heritage, pride, culture, religion, and community. But if the native majority does the same, suddenly we need a government inquiry, a BBC panel, and a nervous statement from the Home Office. How odd. This is why the flag has returned to the streets, windows, cars, and estates. It's not just patriotism, it is a signal. People are saying, we are still here. This is still our home. We are not prepared to be morally blackmailed into silence. And no, this is not about attacking every immigrant or every Muslim. Many people who come to Britain believe in order, work, family, law and loyalty far more strongly than the liberal elites who invited the chaos. The issue is not ethnicity. The issue is whether Britain has the confidence to demand assimilation, demand and defend its laws, and put national cohesion above fashionable guilt. The ruling class has confused compassion with surrender. It has treated border control with cruelty, national pride as extremism, and public concern as a disease to be managed. But the voters are not stupid. They can see the housing pressure. They can see the small boats. They can see the grooming gang failures. They can see policing priorities. They can see politicians afraid of plain speech. Britain is not merely having an immigration debate, it is having an identity crisis. And the question now is brutally simple. Does Britain still have the right to remain Britain? Now zoom out from Britain, because the same pattern appears globally. The world is not dealing with separate crises. Iran, Ukraine, Gaza, Taiwan, the Red Sea, the Gulf, Europe, Russia, China. All these are not random fires. They are connected fronts in a system under pressure. At the center is the American empire, or if that phrase upsets anybody, let's call it the rules-based international order, because that sounds nicer and comes with a conference badge. The United States is not simply reacting to events. It is trying to preserve a system built on the dollar, debt, energy control, military dependence, and strategic obedience. That system requires allies to buy American weapons, use American finance, depend on American protection, and accept American leadership, even when that leadership produces disaster after disaster. Iran is part of this. Ukraine is part of this. Europe's energy dependency is part of this. The pressure on China is part of this. War has changed. It's no longer just tanks crossing borders. It is sanctions, frozen assets, sabotage pipelines, disruptive shipping, drone strikes, refinery attacks, currency pressure, debt manipulation, and information warfare. Very modern, very civilized, much better than old-fashioned war, except everyone still ends up poorer, angrier, and closer to disaster. Europe has already been pulled deep into this system. Cheap energy, Russian energy is gone, and industry weakened, defense spending rising, Russian assets frozen, political independence shrinking, and yet European leaders still talk as if they are powerful global actors while behaving like branch managers of a collapsing imperial franchise. Then there's the Middle East. Iran cannot surrender without losing its strategic position. Israel's hardliners see opportunity in chaos. Gulf states fear Iranian power. Washington fears losing control over energy flows and dollar dominance. So everyone keeps walking towards the cliff while explaining that the situation is completely manageable. That is always the language before catastrophe. Manageable, calibrated, proportionate, limited. The American strategy now looks increasingly like Fortress North America. Secure in the hemisphere, sell weapons and energy, force allies into dependency, and turn the rest of the world into managed conflict zones. Europe handles Russia. Israel and the Gulf states handle Iran. Japan and South Korea help contain China. America supplies the tools, the loans, the systems, and the speeches. It is cynical, yes, but not incoherent. The tragedy is that the American Republic and the American Empire are not the same thing. The Republic still has energy, regions, people, culture, constitutional memory, and renewal potential, but the Empire is consuming it from within. And that is the greatest danger. The Empire may destroy the Republic before the Republic can save itself. Now let's talk about Europe, where apparently the strategy is to slowly remove American protection while simultaneously escalating a proxy war against a nuclear power, which, to be fair, sounds like exactly the kind of brilliant geopolitical planning modern Europe specializes in these days. The United States is clearly beginning to retrench. Troops are being reduced, deployments reconsidered, Washington increasingly focused on China. the Pacific and protecting its own strategic position rather than permanently babysitting Europe forever. And honestly, from the American perspective, that makes sense. The problem is not with withdrawal itself. The problem is Europe appears determined to escalate at precisely the same moment America becomes less interested in managing the consequences. That is where things get extremely dangerous. European governments continue expanding drone production, weapons manufacturing, strike capabilities, sanctions, and deeper support for Ukrainian operations inside Russian territory, all while assuming escalation somehow remains controllable. Because apparently every European leader now believes they are simultaneously Churchill, Napoleon, and a Twitter activist. The dangerous part is how Moscow may interpret this. If Russia concludes that relations with Washington are collapsing anyway, and if it believes the United States is becoming less willing to intervene directly in Europe, then Moscow may decide deterrence has to be restored through force rather than restraint. And that changes the entire equation. So far, much more of the war has remained relatively contained geographically. Brutal, yes, but still limited compared to what Russia could theoretically unleash. But if escalation continues, Moscow may increasingly shift towards overwhelming missile campaigns, infrastructure destruction, energy attacks, and large-scale degrading of Ukraine's ability to function as a state. And then comes the real problem. If European states respond by enabling deeper strikes inside Russia itself, and if Russian leadership begins viewing European factories, logistic hubs, and drone production facilities as direct components of the war effort, then eventually the line between supporting Ukraine and being part of the war disappears. That is how an Article 5 crisis becomes possible. At that point, Washington faces the nightmare scenario, being dragged back into Europe-Russia confrontation precisely while trying to strategically disengage from Europe. Genius. Absolute genius. The deeper issue here is psychological. Europe increasingly frames the war in moral absolutes. Russia is evil. Negotiation is weakness. Diplomacy is appeasement. Compromise is betrayal. And everything becomes emotionally total. Now, emotionally, people may understand that language. Strategically, it is catastrophic. Because wars do not end because one side posts enough flags on social media. Wars end through exhaustion, collapse, negotiation, deterrence, or total destruction. And if diplomacy itself becomes morally forbidden, then permanent escalation becomes the only remaining policy. That is the trap Europe is walking into. And what makes it even more surreal is that the same leaders talking about strategic autonomy remain heavily dependent on American intelligence, American weapon systems, American logistics, American finance, and American military protection. So Europe wants independence, while simultaneously escalating a war that could force America back into Europe under the worst conditions than before. Meanwhile, Russia believes harsher military pressure will restore deterrence. Europe believes more pressure will eventually break Russia, and Washington believes it can slowly step away without first stabilizing the situation. All three assumptions may be disastrously wrong, and that is why this war is no longer just about Ukraine. It is becoming a test of whether modern Western leadership still understands the difference between deterrence and escalation, or whether Europe is now sleepwalking into a confrontation nobody actually knows how to stop. And this brings us to the final and most dangerous point, nuclear escalation. Because once empires start failing, they do not usually become calm, humble, reflective, and reasonable. They become more aggressive, more paranoid, more convinced that one more escalation will restore control. The Ukraine war is no longer just about Ukraine. That is the uncomfortable truth. It has become a confrontation between Russia and the Western Bloc, fought through Ukrainian territory, Western weapons, intelligence support, sanctions, drones, long-range strikes, and strategic messaging. Everyone pretends the war is still indirect, but the line between indirect and direct has become very thin indeed. From Moscow's hardline view, NATO is already waging war while hiding behind technicalities. weapons are supplied, targets are enabled, intelligence is shared, Russian territory is hit, strategic assets are threatened, and Western leaders still say, no, we are not involved. That may work in a press conference. It may not work in a nuclear crisis. The most dangerous development is the belief growing on both sides that escalation can be controlled. The West believes Russia will keep absorbing pressure because it has done so before. Russian hardliners believe restraint has only invited more pressure. Each side reads the other's caution as weakness. That is how deterrence dies. The nuclear taboo survived because leaders understood that nuclear war could not produce a meaningful victory. But now some strategists are again talking of a limited nuclear use, symbolic strikes, and controlled escalation are tools of policy. That is not strategy, that is gambling with civilization. Europe is especially vulnerable. European leaders speak as if they can escalate against Russia without becoming the battlefield. Britain talks tough. Germany rearms. France discusses deterrence. The Baltic states demand harder measures. Yep. Everyone performs strength. But if direct conflict comes, Europe is not watching from the balcony. Europe will be the stage. And let's be honest, the arms control structure is weaker, trust is lower, communication is worse, and political leaders are more theatrical than any point in decades. So the crisis is not just about one missile, one drone strike, one radar site, or one tanker seizure. It is the chain. Early warning systems, strategic bombers, maritime choke points, sanctions, long-range weapons, energy routes, political ultimatums, proxy forces. All of this is now connected. The world is moving from Western dominance into a multipolar rivalry, and instead of building new rules, the major powers are testing old limits. That is why this moment matters. The danger is not that one side wants nuclear war. The danger is that each side believes the other will blink first. History is full of dead empires that believe that exactly. Now let's move from collapsing empires and possible nuclear war to something much lighter, more cheerful, humans trying to defeat death itself. Because apparently Silicon Valley looked at aging, mortality and human condition and decided, you know what this needs? Venture capital. Over thousands of years, every civilization accepts one basic reality. You get old, things stop working, and eventually you die. Kings died, emperors died, philosophers died, billionaires died. Even people selling miracle anti-aging creams at 3 a.m. eventually disappear into the void. But now, suddenly, humanity thinks it may be able to engineer its way out of a biological decline. And honestly, this may be the most important story of the century. The phrase is being discussed more and more is longevity escape velocity, LEV. Very science fiction, very cyberpunk. Sounds like a rejected title from a Christopher Nolan film. But the idea is simple. Medical technology advances so fast that each year you survive, science adds more than just another year to your lifespan. In other words, aging loses the race. Now critics hear this and immediately picture immortality tomorrow morning. That is not what researchers are talking about. No one is claiming that people will suddenly become immortal space vampires by next Thursday. The real shift is that aging itself is increasingly being treated as an engineering problem instead of an unavoidable destiny. That changes everything. Medicine traditionally treats diseases one at a time: cancer, heart disease, dementia, diabetes. But longevity science says those are downstream effects of the same underlying process, aging damage. So instead of endless patching failing systems, researchers are trying to repair the biological damage itself. And this is where things become genuinely extraordinary. Artificial intelligence is now accelerating biology at insane speed. AI systems can analyze proteins, simulate drug interactions, process gigantic medical datasets, and identify possible treatments faster than entire research teams could do a decade ago. Then you have the CRISPR gene editing. Scientists literally edit DNA like software patches. We are now at the point where researchers are experimenting with resetting cellular age markers. In animal experiments, old cells have shown characteristics associated with youth again. That sentence alone would have sounded completely insane 20 years ago. Then there are stem cells, lab-grown organs, cyanolytics, removing old damaged cells, tissue engineering, regenerative medicine. Humanity is slowly building a repair toolkit for the human body. The key point is convergence. No single miracle cure is likely to appear. This is not going to be one genius scientist in a white coat yelling, "Eureka! Aging is cancelled." It's a compounding effect of multiple technologies accelerating together. And if the acceleration continues, the implications are almost impossible to overstate. Retirement systems collapse, pension models break, housing markets change, careers become unrecognizable, marriage changes, family structures change, politics changes. Imagine leaders staying physically and mentally well, functionally for decades longer. Imagine billionaires living dramatically longer than ordinary people. Because let's be honest, the first immortals are not going to be probably the people working at a supermarket. That is the uncomfortable part. Longevity could become the ultimate inequality technology. Regardless of the exact timeline, something historic has already happened psychologically. Humanity has crossed a line where aging is no longer universally accepted as fixed. For the first time in history, our species is seriously attempting to treat mortality itself as a solvable technical problem. And once civilization starts viewing death as a system's failure instead of fate, the future becomes very strange indeed. Before the end of tonight's show, I want to quickly mention the Systems at Scale book series, because honestly, a huge amount of what we talk about on this channel connects directly to these books. The series is not about killer robots, Hollywood apocalypse scenarios, or AI suddenly becoming evil because somebody pressed the wrong glowing button in a laboratory somewhere. It's about something far more realistic and probably far more dangerous. The emergence of systems that are becoming too large, too integrated, too automated, and too interconnected for traditional human control. Book 1, The Point of No Return, explores how AI, infrastructure, logistics, finance, energy, and data are converging into a single operational environment, and why that transition has already begun whether governments fully understand it or not. Book 2, The Human Outcome Spectrum, examines how the future is no longer one predictable path, but a narrowing range of possible system outcomes. Some futures remain relatively stable, others move towards concentration of power, instability, dependency, and the gradual loss of human leverage inside increasingly autonomous systems. Book 3, The Control Remains, focuses on what human agency actually looks like once direct control begins to disappear. It looks at positioning, adaptation, timing, and influence inside systems that now operate continuously beyond normal political cycles and institutional reaction speeds. Together, these books connect the dots between AI, geopolitics, economics, automation, digital infrastructure, logistics, energy systems, surveillance, and societal transformation. And honestly, they explain why the modern world increasingly feels like it is accelerating faster than governments, institutions, media systems, and populations can psychologically process. Because the real story of the 21st century may not be politics anymore. It may be systems scaling beyond human comprehension. And what eventually led to the writing of tonight's sponsors of the show, the quantum hemispheres, the rise of ARCO, was the realization that these ideas no longer belong in analysis or non-fiction. Because once you truly understand how systems scale, how AI integrates into infrastructure, how operational networks begin replacing institutional governance, you start to see what the world could realistically look like in a few decades from now. That is where the rise of ARCO begins. The novel takes the concepts explored in the Systems at Scale series and projects them forward into a geopolitical science fiction world where the system has matured, where AI-driven infrastructure, orbital governance, autonomous logistics, algorithmic management, and machine-coordinated civilization are no longer experimental trends, but the foundation of global society itself. And that's what makes the book unsettling, is how plausible it feels. The nations still exist, governments still exist, Elections still exist, but the increasingly real power flows through systems operating underneath politics itself. That is the world of Arco. The novel explores what happens when intelligence becomes infrastructure, when governance becomes automated, and when the line between political authority and operational systems begin to disappear entirely. So, the Systems at Scale books explain the structure. The quantum hemispheres shows what living inside that structure might actually feel like. And honestly, that is why so many readers move directly from non-fiction to the series into The Rise of Arco afterwards, because the novel transforms abstract theory into a fully realized world. All of the books are available globally on Amazon in paperback and Kindle editions now. One more thing before we finish tonight. The show is now looking for guests from different countries around the world to come on and talk about what is really happening on the ground in their part of the world. Not polished media talking points, not government-approved narratives, just real people explaining what they are seeing in their cities, their economies, their political systems, and their daily lives as the world continues to change at an incredible pace. So whether you're in Europe, the United States, Russia, Asia, and the Middle East, South America, Africa, or anywhere else, if you have something important to say and want to appear on the show, get in contact. The email is in the description below. Alright everyone, that is where we're going to leave it tonight. We covered media warfare, demographics instability, imperial decline, Europe's escalation trap, nuclear confrontation risks, artificial intelligence, longevity science, and the possibility that humanity may eventually start treating death itself as a technical malfunction. So overall, a very calm and reassuring evening for the first show back. But honestly, this is a world we are living in now. The systems surrounding civilization are becoming larger, faster, more integrated, and increasingly harder for governments or populations to fully understand. Political institutions are reacting slower than technological change. Economic systems are becoming more unstable. Information warfare now shapes perception before events are even understood. And global powers continue escalating while simultaneously insisting everything remains under control, which historically is always a wonderful, comforting sign. The central problem is that modern civilization still psychologically thinks it is living in a stable post-Cold War world of the 1990s, while technologically and geopolitically it has already entered something completely different. And that gap between perception and reality may become one of the most dangerous things of all. A huge thank you to everybody supporting the channel, sharing the streams, and helping the community grow, continue to grow. We just hit slightly over 20,000 subscribers on Rumble, and we hope to get to 25 by the end of this month. So please join the channel. After 6 weeks away, it is generally great to finally be back live from Minsk again with a new studio fully up and running. Although the new cameras didn't arrive yet. We've got some black magic cameras coming and they'll be here in a few weeks. And once again, thank you for the sponsor of tonight's show, the Quantum Hemispheres, The Rise of Arco, along with the wider Systems at Scale series, because honestly, a lot of the themes we discussed tonight are exactly the kinds of trajectories explored throughout those books. If you enjoyed tonight's show, make sure you subscribe, follow, support the channel, and share the stream around. So everybody stay safe, stay aware, question everything, and I'll see you on the next live show. Bye-bye.